It was a sunny, beautiful day. A father and son are standing on a hill looking down at the workers cutting down trees. The father asks his son what he thinks about a question. What does he think is the most necessary virtue for a lord? The son looks at his father with curiosity and uncertainty. He is surprised by this turn of events. Why this question? He answers uncertainly that it is probably generosity. The father says that this is not a bad answer. The son then asks, what is the right answer if he is wrong? The father replies that the most important virtue for a lord is a kind and warm heart. The father is Richard Valencia, Lord Leshill. The son did not understand his father's answer and asked him if he thought he had a good heart. Then the father began to explain that the virtue required of a lord depends on the situation in each case. A lord must be able to be a friend, a part of the family, and sometimes a villain. And his son must learn to be in all these different roles. And no matter what situation he finds himself in, as long as he does his best, he will be able to form an alliance with anyone he meets in his life. Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from outside. A laborer was running toward them with a question. When the worker came running up, he apologized for interrupting their conversation and asked the Lord to do one thing he knew of, if it was not difficult. Richard replied that yes, he would do it without any problem. But before he did, he asked his son Simon and the laborer Charles to step aside. The tired laborer breathed a sigh of relief. And the Lord stretched out his hand and began to say the spell. Simon watched his father's magic with admiration. Richard summoned a portal from which waves of black magic began to erupt, covering the ground in front of him. Where the magic hit the ground, it began to boil and bubble. From this boiling liquid, skeletal hands began to appear. And in a second, almost a dozen full-length skeletons rose from the puddle with the characteristic sound of bones clattering. The skeletons began to stare at Simon and the worker. With a smile, the worker pointed to the skeletons at a pile of large trunks that the workers had cut down earlier. They looked at him carefully, and then at the trunks that were pointed out to them, and walked over to them. In a moment, they began to move them to the joyful applause of the worker, who was glad to be able to take a break. The worker was very grateful and thanked the foreman loudly. He replied that he had no problem with that, as long as the worker continued to work hard. Simon was proud of what a great necromancer his father was, that he could provide his workers with additional labor using skeletons. A small digression follows, which tells the story of necromancers. In this world, necromancers are special magicians who use black and dark magic. With its help, they can summon and revive long-dead creatures. Once upon a time, an emperor lived in this world who wanted to destroy necromancers so that they could not influence his empire in any way. He ruled the empire of Thalhern, and for this task he sent 50,000 soldiers. This army was called the Rose Brigade. The headquarters of the necromancers was in Kizen, and they knew what the emperor was planning against them, so 10 necromancers opposed the emperor's army. Only 10 necromancers, but all 50,000 soldiers of the Rose Brigade were destroyed and turned into the undead. Thus began the destruction of the empire. The destruction of the Rose Brigade eventually led to the surrender of the remnants of the Thalhern Empire. In order to take revenge on the arrogant emperor, necromancers turned him into the undead. And the emperor met his miserable end in the form of a rotting corpse, permanently sitting on the throne of the empire. Thus began a new era of necromancers' rule. They were able to conquer half of the entire continent without meeting any worthy resistance. But another force stopped and threatened the dominance of the necromancers, ruling the other half of the continent. These were the priests. The only antagonists of the necromancers who served and worshipped the goddess Devi. But for now, there was a fragile peace between the two opposing forces on the continent. But this did not apply to our domain, where the workers and the undead worked together. Under the watchful eye of their lord, who also liked the way they worked together. This was the town of Leshill. Here, too, humans and undead worked well together, and the power of necromancers was used for good. If you look at the map, it is barely visible, surrounded by large cities and castles. Not even all the neighboring villages knew about the existence of this town. Our main character's name is Simon. He is the heir to this property, and in the future he is to become its lord. He is still a very young and joyful boy, but his father was sure that he had a great future ahead of him. So, the Academy of Necromancers and a Genius Recruit. This is the title of our fascinating story, which I invite you to dive into. Simon returned home after helping his father. They had a small, but nice house for lords. His mother was already waiting for him at home and welcomed his return. Her name was Anna Valencia. Simon was also happy to see her and told her that he had just been helping with the logs. Simon walked over to the stove. His mother told him that he must be hungry by then, but to wait a little longer. He looked at what she was cooking and asked what it was. It was water infused with leharka mushrooms. They looked dangerous even at first glance. And Simon told his mother that they were poisonous, but she was not at all fazed and assured him that he should not worry about anything. She would make them edible with magic. And she began to use her bright light magic on her brew. Dazzled, Simon was shocked by the holiness of this magic. His mother was a former priest and her power fully proved it. Every time he saw her power, Simon wondered how his parents could have met if they were complete opposites. And he imagined his happy parents together. But his thoughts were interrupted by his mother's voice telling him to stop staring at those mushrooms. She asked him why he wasn't going to eat. Hungry, Simon could not disagree. He walked over to the table, which was filled with various tasty and fragrant dishes. They waited for his father to come and started eating together, but Simon ate very little, and his mother noticed. She asked if he was sick. While his father absorbed everything with incredible strength. In the afternoon, when Simon was about to go to his room, he noticed his mother making his father a cucumber face mask. And looking at them, he thought it was as if they were still on their honeymoon, they were so happy. In the evening of that wonderful day, Simon watched the full, beautiful moon from his room. And when he said good night to his parents and was about to close the door to his room, a letter suddenly flew in and stuck right to the face of the surprised Simon, who lost his balance from the surprise. He got up and peeled the letter away from his face, wondering what it was. And when he turned to the window, he noticed a girl sitting on it. She had appeared there as if with the rustling of leaves. And now she was greeting him with a smile on her face. Surprised, Simon was a little scared and could not say anything in response. He turned his back on her without answering, as if he had not seen anything. He thought it was a hallucination or a dream. So he decided to lie down on the bed and fall asleep. However, the girl was not going to give up and jumped into the room screaming. She was screaming at him not to pretend not to see her. But Simon just laid down on his bed and covered himself with a blanket, hoping that by ignoring her he could get rid of her. But the girl didn't give up. She said she knew he could see her. She began to pull off his blanket. She asked him to get up now. But none of them gave up, and each of them pulled the blanket in his own direction. Simon realized that they would not let go of him and exhaled tiredly. Then he sat down on the bed and asked who she was. How did she get here? Was she lost? The girl irritably assured him that she was not lost and that he was stupid. She said confidently that she was here to see him, Simon Valentius. She pointed her finger directly at him. He asked in surprise how she knew his name. And she started to explain about the letter, when... Bam! Simon's parents heard strange noises in his room and burst in. They asked what was going on. Wasn't it a burglar who broke into their house? Both of them in their pajamas, armed with a frying pan and a rolling pin, they looked rather funny or scary, but... The girl who was already sitting on Simon's bed greeted them happily, calling them by name. She knew Richard and Anna. And they knew her. Her name was Naftis and she was very happy to see them. Amazed, Simon watched as his parents greeted this strange visitor with happiness. They noted that she had not changed at all and how much they missed her and she missed them. His parents told Simon to introduce himself with all due courtesy. This is the legendary Neftis Arkbold. And she began to look proudly at Simon. And then he began to remember everything he had been told. He looked at her with disbelief. Was it really Naftis Arkbold? No way. Are you sure it was Neftis Arkbold? She was the one who had made the emperor of the Thalhern Empire her dead puppet. Could she be the same witch of death who had lived for over 300 years? And she told him that yes, she was the very same Neftis Arkbold of Kizen. Excited, Simon began to understand what the letter that had come to him meant. Could it be the same one? And he began to open the letter. Naftis asked for permission to make him a formal proposal. With a trembling hand he began to take the letter out of the envelope. Opening it, he began to read. It was indeed an invitation. The letter informed him that he had been accepted to study at the Necromancer Academy in Kizen because of his great potential. After he read the letter, Nephthys extended her hand to him and invited him to come to Kizen. As she said goodbye, she told him that they would see each other in Kizen. And she was looking forward to seeing him there. And she disappeared into the moonlight. Simon was left to contemplate the breeze that picked up the leaves and the moonlight that filled everything around him. His father interrupted Simon's thoughts by asking to see the letter. He wanted to examine everything in detail because he was worried about his son, although he always knew that this day would come sooner or later. Simon couldn't help but agree, so he quickly gave the letter to his father. Richard began to read the letter aloud. But Simon interrupted him with a question. He asked his father what the letter meant when it referred to Kizen. His father began to explain to him that it was the center of the Dark Alliance and the headquarters of the necromancers. This place also serves as a school for the education of young necromancers. The chancellor of this school in Kizen is Nephthys, whom he had just seen. Simon asked incredulously, "Chancellor?" And his memory flashed back to her behavior when she was here, more like a child than an adult. Richard noticed the expression on his son's face and told him that she really didn't look like a chancellor, but that it didn't matter at all, because looks can be deceiving. Simon had so many questions. And he didn't know where to start. The first thing he asked was where was Kizen? Was it far from their home? His father, plunging into old memories, answered that it was really far away. Kizen is located on an island called Roke. And you can get there only by ship, which sails from Langerstein, the capital of the kingdom of Dresden. Then, on that ship, you have to sail for quite a long time to reach the right island. However, his father assured him that he shouldn't worry, there were many interesting and fun things to do in Langerstein, and the island of Roke itself was an incredibly beautiful place. And Kizen is also known for its stylized uniforms worn by its residents. Surprised, Simon repeated, "Uniforms." Simon asked what was going to happen and how. His mother replied that this would keep him busy until the initiation ceremony began. His father assured him that there was still much to prepare and do to become a necromancer. He should study hard at school to gain the necessary skills. However, first they were going to open his core. The mother asked the father if he wanted to teach his son a little bit of black magic. The father was all for it and said he would be happy to teach him. He also told Simon that he should learn how to breathe properly, so he shouldn't expect to sleep until tomorrow. They had a lot to do. Joyful and confused at the same time, he did not even know what to say to his parents. He was breathless about the upcoming trip. After meeting with Nephthys that day, Simon began the busiest week of his life. There were so many things to prepare for Kizen. His mom and dad had nothing but good things to say about the school and convinced him that he would have fun there and would love it. But the sudden news of their son's departure worried them both. His father continued to teach him. He told him that some spells might hurt, but he had to be patient. And Simon endured all the pain and tried his best. For 3 days this week, he didn't sleep at all as he formed the core with his father's magic. After the grueling hours of core formation, he needed to spend the rest of the day learning breathing techniques and taking a crash course in black magic from his father. A week later, the boy, who had never left his native Les Hill and had spent his entire life here, set off on a journey. He was accompanied by all the servants and his mother. His father went with him. His mother had tears in her eyes and asked them to be careful. The servants were also very concerned about their masters and wished them a safe journey. That was the beginning of their departure to Kizen. They had already traveled some distance and the father continued his black magic lessons. He advised Simon to draw the magical power into his body, which surrounds him everywhere in the air around him. And slowly start to control the mana inside. After that, Simon had to move it through his core. It was as simple as that. His father wondered if he could feel the mana getting harder inside him. Simon did not answer, he was completely focused on the process. The blue energy began to surround him from all sides and it seemed that he was drawing energy from the environment into his core. His father advised him to direct the mana to flow through his hands. He did exactly what his father told him and he succeeded. Now he had to let the mana flow through his fingers. And streams of blue drops flowed down his fingers. Large blue drops seeped out at the tips of his fingers. His father praised him, he was a good boy and a quick learner. Now he knew the source of a necromancer's power. Darkness. Simon looked closely at the dark blue drop on his finger. His father went on to explain to him that the biggest difference between an ordinary magician and a necromancer is in the darkness. Mana has the property of being a gas, which makes it low density and prone to dispersion in the air. On the other hand, darkness is closer to solids or liquids. Therefore, it is easy to bind and change its shape. And he showed him on his hand. So if he uses the properties of darkness, he can shape it into a shape like this. And he showed him a miniature doll on his hand that looked like his mother with a frying pan and a spatula in her hands. Simon was fascinated by this skill. But his father continued to tell him that those who practice and improve their skills in controlling the power based on darkness are called necromancers. And he clenched his fist and smashed the icon he had created before. But since they didn't have a lot of time now, he suggested that Simon focus on the basics of mining the darkness into his core. Simon agreed with his father. And he began to gather the darkness on his hands. At first, it was just a few drops. But then, thanks to his diligence, he managed to form a whole puddle of darkness. Then he began to form something that looked like a hair from a distance, but his creation was shaking and too liquid. And as expected, in a moment his hair spread all over his hands, not holding its shape. His father watched his attempts with a smile. He thought to himself that he could not believe it. He was very impressed and surprised. It usually takes about 6 months to 2 years to learn how to form objects using darkness. But Simon moved in leaps and bounds and achieved it in just 3 days. After a few attempts, he was able to create a stable structure with flowers and a bird. His father, meanwhile, continued to reflect that he knew his son was talented, but he didn't think he was that talented. Such an incredible talent could have shot him in the back. He didn't put off helping him with the core until now, hoping that he wouldn't repeat his mistakes that he made in his youth. Many dark mistakes that he did not want to remember. But on reflection, he realized that it was time to let his talent explode. He hoped his son would do better than him and not make as many mistakes. In the meantime, Simon was busy making something. Then he showed his creation to his father. It was a dark blue fire. He said it was called a midnight glow, a very special kind of fire. His father thoughtfully remarked that his darkness was a beautiful shade of blue. Simon was very excited and asked his father if it was a good thing that his darkness was this midnight blue color. Is it a rare shade for necromancers? Did it make him talented? Or just smiled in response. And then he said that it was just a color and it didn't affect anything. At this news, Simon's hands dropped and his sparkle evaporated. Their carriage stopped with a squeak of wheels. And the driver of their carriage said that they had arrived. His father told him that not at all, this was just the border of the kingdom of Dresden. Here he had to leave it. Simon was saddened by this news, but just in case he asked what he meant. His father replied that he was sorry that he could not tell him the reason. But because of ancient events, he could not enter the territory of the kingdom of Dresden. It was a long time ago and it is a long story. The father began to instruct Simon that he should decide for himself and think before every action. Simon was very confused. Richard assured him that he shouldn't worry, he could guarantee him that he would cope with everything that awaited him better than anyone else. And he is really proud to have such a wonderful son. The father remained standing on the road, watching the carriage that was taking his son to a new life. He wished him good luck and safety on his journey as he saw the last outlines of the carriage in the distance.